A 72-year-old man sat alone in the corner of Burger King, quietly eating his burger as three teenagers in designer clothes pointed and snickered. Their mockery grew louder, drawing uncomfortable glances from other customers as they took photos and offered him spare change with exaggerated kindness. When a broad-shouldered stranger finally approached their table, his stern gaze silenced their laughter. If you'd like to hear more stories like this one, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. The afternoon rush at Burger King brought its usual chaos of sizzling grills and bustling customers. Amid the noise and activity, an elderly man sat alone in the far corner of the restaurant. His weathered hands carefully unwrapped a simple hamburger as the world moved quickly around him. His clothes were worn and tattered, showing signs of age and use. But there was something about his posture, a quiet dignity that seemed out of place in the fast food environment. Most customers were too busy with their own meals to notice him. Families chatted over their trays, workers rushed to their next shift, and teenagers huddled around smartphones. The elderly man seemed content with his solitude, methodically eating his meal while occasionally gazing out the window. In stark contrast to the old man's humble appearance, three teenagers entered the restaurant, drawing attention with their loud voices and confident demeanor. They carried themselves with the kind of assurance that comes from privilege, strutting to a table not far from where the old man sat. After ordering their meals, the tallest boy noticed the elderly man in the corner. He nudged his friends and whispered something that made them all turn to look. What began as subtle glances quickly evolved into more obvious staring and snickering. The tallest teenager leaned in toward his friends, eyes still fixed on the elderly man. He wondered aloud if the old guy even had money for his food or was just there to collect leftovers. His friends erupted in poorly concealed laughter at the cruel observation. The second boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a coin. With exaggerated kindness that dripped with mockery, he suggested they should leave some spare change for the poor old fellow. The third teenager, not wanting to be outdone, pulled out his smartphone and proposed they take pictures for social media, suggesting hashtags about poverty and homelessness. With each comment, their laughter grew louder and more confidence, creating a disturbing chorus that began to draw attention from nearby tables. Throughout their mockery, the elderly man continued eating his burger, seemingly unaware or perhaps choosing to ignore the cruel attention directed his way. A woman sitting at a nearby table with two young children noticed the commotion. Her expression hardened as she watched the teenagers' behavior. Finally, she turned toward them with a disapproving frown and asked them to please keep it down, gesturing toward her children who were becoming disturbed by the noise. Instead of showing any remorse, one of the teenagers turned to her with an aggressive stance. He told her to mind her own business, his tone carrying an implied threat that made the woman pull her children closer to her. She turned away, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to escalate the situation further. Seeing this interaction, a middle-aged man from another table stood up and approached the boys. He suggested they show some respect, particularly to their elders. His intervention only fueled their arrogance. The teenagers laughed harder and made threatening gestures toward him as well. The man backed away, deciding it wasn't worth the trouble. Several families began moving to tables further away from the commotion. The restaurant atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the teenagers, emboldened by their ability to intimidate others, returned their attention to mocking the elderly man. They took photos and made exaggerated imitations of his hunched posture. In the corner of the restaurant, a broad-shouldered man had been watching the scene unfold while finishing his meal. Unlike the others who had tried to intervene, there was something different about this man. He carried himself with quiet confidence, observing the situation with growing disapproval. Finally, he stood up. He was tall with arms that suggested years of physical work. His movements were deliberate and measured as he approached the teenagers' table. There was no hesitation in his steps, just purposeful motion that seemed to command the attention of everyone nearby. The restaurant grew quieter as he positioned himself between the teenagers and the elderly man, his back straight and his expression firm but controlled. The teenagers' laughter died in their throats as they looked up at him, suddenly uncertain of themselves. The man spoke in a voice that wasn't particularly loud, but carried a weight that demanded attention. He told them they should reconsider who they were talking to. His tone remained controlled, but there was underlying anger in his words that made the teenagers freeze in their seats. All eyes in the restaurant turned toward their table. Before addressing them further, The stranger exchanged a brief nod with the elderly man, a small gesture that suggested some connection between them. The teenagers noticed this and shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of the teenagers, trying to maintain his earlier bravado, nervously attempted to dismiss the situation. He claimed the elderly man was just some old nobody, and they were only having a bit of fun. His voice cracked slightly at the end, betraying his growing unease. The stranger remained unmoved, his gaze unwavering as he explained that appearances can be deceiving. He asked them if they knew anything about the man they were mocking, challenging them to consider the disrespect they were showing to a complete stranger. By now, conversations throughout the restaurant had stopped. Everyone was watching the confrontation unfold. The elderly man finally lifted his head, revealing tired but remarkably sharp eyes that held unexpected depth. He didn't speak, but there was something about his gaze that commanded respect. The teenagers shifted uncomfortably under his steady look. The atmosphere grew heavy with anticipation as the stranger continued. That was when he revealed the truth that would change everything. The man they had been mocking was actually a decorated war hero, whose story had been featured in the local newspaper just the previous week. The stranger explained that he recognized the veteran from the article that detailed his extraordinary acts of courage during combat and the numerous lives he had saved. The newspaper had shown this same humble man, now quietly eating his burger alone, once standing proud in uniform with medals across his chest. For the first time since the confrontation began, the veteran himself spoke. His voice was steady with quiet strength as he told them he had fought for their freedom so they could sit there and laugh. He asked if he should now be ashamed simply because he had grown old. The teenagers noticed his hands for the first time, scarred and worn, with slight tremors that spoke of physical sacrifice and years of hardship. These were hands that had once carried wounded comrades to safety, hands that had served his country with honor. Physical evidence of sacrifice that the teenagers had completely overlooked in their rush to judgment. The restaurant remained silent as the weight of realization settled over everyone present. The teenagers' expressions transformed from arrogance to shame as the reality of their actions sank in. The contrast between their expensive clothes and the veterans' worn attire now seemed to represent something entirely different than what they had initially assumed. Humbled and visibly ashamed, the boys struggled to find appropriate words. One of them finally managed to stutter out a weak apology. All his previous confidence completely evaporated. His eyes were fixed on the floor, unable to meet the gaze of either the veteran or the stranger who had exposed their cruelty. The veteran responded not with anger, but with the wisdom that comes from a life fully lived. He told them that respect begins with understanding, and that when they see someone who looks different or doesn't have as much, they should remember they don't know that person's story. Everyone carries burdens and histories that aren't visible on the surface. As the teenagers prepared to leave, clearly eager to escape the situation they had created, one boy hesitated. His face showed genuine regret as he reached into his pocket and pulled out an untouched meal voucher. With hands that trembled slightly, he placed it on the old man's table and mumbled that he knew it wasn't much, but maybe it was a way to say thank you. The veteran said nothing in response but simply reached out and patted the boy's shoulder, a silent gesture of forgiveness that spoke volumes. It was a moment of connection that transcended the gap in their ages and experiences. The teenager nodded once before hurrying to join his friends who were already heading for the exit. As they left, the restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but something had changed. Several patrons nodded respectfully toward the veteran, and a family from across the restaurant sent over desserts to his table. The broad-shouldered stranger sat down across from the veteran, and they began a quiet conversation like old friends. The lesson learned that day in an ordinary Burger King would likely stay with those teenagers for years to come. A reminder that behind every face is a story, and behind some faces are stories of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. How many heroes do we pass by every day without even knowing it?